Welcome to Silent Betrayals. Please like this video and subscribe to Relation Tales. Let's begin. Marriage is a paradox. In the beginning, it promises everything. A future filled with shared dreams, unshakable trust, and endless affection. For Caleb and Marissa, that promise felt real when they exchanged vows 7 years ago. Marissa had captured Caleb's heart from the moment they met. Her laughter was infectious, her intelligence sharp, and her presence magnetic. Yet, like many great stories, theirs carried the seeds of its own downfall. The cracks in their life together began small. Marissa, once devoted, started pulling away in subtle ways. Late nights at work, missed dinners, and a phone constantly in her hand. Caleb ignored these signs, trusting her explanations. But trust can be a double-edged sword. When it breaks, it leaves wounds that never fully heal. New Year's Eve changed everything. It was supposed to be like their other quiet celebrations. Staying in, watching fireworks from the balcony, sharing champagne, and reminiscing about fond memories. But Marissa announced a sudden plan, a party at her coworker's house. Caleb masked his unease with a smile. "Go enjoy yourself," he said, though his gut told a different story. She left, looking stunning in a sequin dress Caleb had never seen before. It clung to her in ways that made him feel both longing and betrayal. She hadn't dressed up like that for him in years. "Don't wait up," she said, her tone almost mocking. The words stung as she walked out, leaving him alone in the emptiness of the house. By midnight, Caleb sat alone on the couch, the distant sound of fireworks barely audible. At 4 a.m., the door creaked open. Marissa stumbled in barefoot, heels in hand. Her glossy hair was slightly messy, and the scent of alcohol mixed with her perfume was overwhelming. Caleb didn't need to look long to notice the evidence. The glaring red hickey on her neck told a story he wasn't ready to hear. She wouldn't admit to it. "Rough night?" Caleb asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Marissa froze, fumbling for an excuse. "Oh, it's nothing," she stammered, touching the mark on her neck as if her hand could make it disappear. One of the girls at the party was just being silly. Her lies hurt more than the betrayal itself. Caleb didn't shout or demand answers. He simply walked past her, leaving her to stew in her own guilt. But his silence wasn't weakness. It was the calm before the storm. That night, Caleb lay awake. The room was dark and quiet, except for the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan. Marissa was already asleep in their bed, her soft breaths an eerie mockery of the storm raging inside him. The image of that red mark was burned into his mind, a damning symbol of her betrayal. It wasn't just the physical infidelity. It was the lies, the slow destruction of the trust he had placed in her. By sunrise, Caleb had made a decision. This wasn't going to end with a quiet divorce or him walking away as the heartbroken husband. No. Marissa needed to face the full weight of her choices in a way she would never forget. He would tear apart her world, piece by piece, just as she had shattered his. Over the next few days, Caleb put his plan into motion. He didn't confront her, nor did he let on that he knew more than she thought. Instead, he played the part of the unaware husband. Marissa seemed relieved, even emboldened by his apparent ignorance. She went about her days with renewed confidence, humming while making breakfast, her phone constantly buzzing with messages she would hastily hide. Caleb didn't need to guess who she was texting. One morning, when she left for work, Caleb began his investigation. Her phone was his first target. He'd seen her enter the passcode enough times to memorize it. It didn't take long to find the incriminating evidence. Text from a man named Brent, filled with inside jokes, flirty emojis, and confessions of love. Caleb's stomach churned as he scrolled through, uncovering their rendezvous plans, complete with photos that Brent had sent her. But Caleb wasn't the type to act impulsively. Instead of confronting her, he forwarded every damaging text and photo to an anonymous email account. This wasn't just about knowing the truth. It was about control. Caleb began crafting the perfect revenge, one that would tear apart the illusion Marissa had so carefully built. He started by securing himself financially. He opened a separate bank account, discreetly transferring funds from their joint account, leaving just enough for Marissa not to notice. He changed the passwords on every shared account, making sure she would lose access to anything he had once generously provided. His next step was gathering allies, or at least ensuring that Marissa's betrayal wouldn't stay private. He compiled the evidence into a folder labeled The Truth About Marissa, a meticulously organized archive with screenshots, photos, and timestamps. But Caleb wasn't finished yet. If Brent thought he could get away unscathed, he was wrong. After a bit of digging, Caleb discovered that Brent was married to a woman named Victoria, a fiercely loyal spouse who had no idea her husband was cheating. Caleb carefully wrote an email to Victoria, attaching the evidence of her husband's affair with Marissa. "I thought you deserved to know the truth. No one should live in the dark." The email read, signed anonymously. While Caleb moved in silence, Marissa's behavior grew more reckless. She started coming home later and later, offering half-hearted excuses about work meetings or catching up with friends. Caleb pretended to believe her, playing his role so convincingly that she completely let her guard down. One night, while Marissa was out, Caleb set the final stage of his plan in motion. He wrote a letter, a short but devastating message he would leave behind. "Marissa, you made your choices and now you'll face the consequences. Don't bother trying to contact me. By the time you read this, I'll be gone, and so will the life." Caleb packed his belongings methodically, leaving nothing behind that she could use to trace him. The house, the shared memories, the life they had built. It all felt like an empty shell now. The morning he left, Caleb felt an unexpected sense of clarity. The sky was overcast, the air crisp and sharp. As he drove away, he didn't feel sadness or regret, only a fierce determination to see his plan through. That same evening, Marissa's world began to crumble. Victoria's response to Caleb's email was swift and explosive. She confronted Brent at his office, causing a scene that quickly spread through their workplace. By the next day, everyone in Marissa's department knew about the affair. Her reputation, once untouchable, was now in ruins. But the fallout didn't stop there. Caleb's carefully timed email blast went out to Marissa's friends, family, and colleagues, exposing her infidelity with unflinching clarity. Screenshots, dates, and a detailed account of her betrayal were laid bare for everyone to see. Marissa's phone blew up with calls and messages, each one more damning than the last. Friends she thought would stand by her began to distance themselves. Her parents, once proud of their seemingly perfect daughter, were now humiliated. As Caleb watched from a distance, he felt no remorse. Marissa's betrayal had stolen his peace, but her downfall was restoring it, piece by piece. Yet there was still one final act in his carefully orchestrated revenge, a confrontation that would leave her with no illusions about the man she had underestimated. Caleb waited until the dust had begun to settle, or rather, until the storm surrounding Marissa had reached its peak. By the end of the week, her world was in tatters. She had been called into a disciplinary meeting at work due to her involvement in the scandal with Brent. Whispers about her unfaithfulness had spread far beyond her social circle. Her calls to Caleb went unanswered, each one sending her deeper into desperation. It was time for the final act. Late one evening, as Marissa sat alone in their now empty house, nursing a glass of wine and scrolling through her phone with trembling fingers, she heard a knock at the door. Startled, she set the glass down and approached cautiously. She opened the door to find Caleb standing there, his face calm but unreadable. "Caleb," she stammered, tears immediately welling in her eyes. She looked at him like a lifeline she didn't deserve but desperately needed. "I didn't think you'd come back." "I'm not here to stay," Caleb said coldly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "But I figured it was time we had a little chat." Marissa's heart raced. She could feel the weight of his presence and the finality in his tone. She followed him into the living room, where the remnants of their shared life remained. His absence was glaring in every empty space, mocking her. "Cut the act," he interrupted, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard. He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a controlled fury that made her shrink back. "You don't get to cry your way out of this. Not this time." Marissa flinched but said nothing. She knew better now. Caleb wasn't here for an apology or an excuse. He was here to deliver something she wouldn't forget. "You think I didn't know?" Caleb began, his words slicing through the silence. "All those nights you were working late, all those texts you tried to hide. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to lie awake, knowing the truth but still hoping, praying?" "I was wrong, Caleb. I never meant to," she started, but he cut her off again. "Don't you dare tell me you didn't mean it," he spat. "You meant every lie, every betrayal. You chose to destroy this marriage, Marissa. You chose to tear us apart because you were too selfish to face the truth." Marissa broke down, collapsing onto the couch as sobs racked her body. But Caleb didn't falter. He wasn't here to comfort her. "I gave you everything," he continued, his voice steady despite the fire burning in his chest. "I trusted you. I loved you. And you threw it all away for what? A fling? A man who didn't even have the decency to respect his own vows." "I was lost," Marissa whispered through her tears. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was unhappy. I made mistakes, horrible mistakes. But I never stopped loving you." Caleb let out a bitter laugh. "You don't destroy the people you love. You don't humiliate them, lie to them, and betray their trust. That's not love, Marissa. That's convenience." Her sobs grew louder, but Caleb remained unmoved. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, tossing it onto the coffee table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Divorce papers," he said flatly. "I've already signed them. All that's left is for you to do the same." Marissa stared at the envelope as though it were a snake ready to strike. "Please, Caleb, don't do this. We can fix this. I'll go to therapy. I'll do anything." "It's too late," Caleb said, his voice softening slightly but remaining firm. "You killed what we had, Marissa, and now you'll have to live with that." Marissa signed the papers that night, her tears smudging the ink as she handed them back to him. Caleb took them without a word, turning to leave. But before he walked out the door, he paused. "You know, Marissa," he said, his back still to her, "I thought I'd feel satisfaction watching your life fall apart. I thought it would make me feel better. But all I feel now is pity." Marissa looked up, her face streaked with tears, but she couldn't muster a response. "Goodbye, Marissa," Caleb said, stepping out into the night without looking back. As Caleb drove away for the last time, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was no joy, no triumph, only a quiet sense of closure. The woman he had once loved was gone, replaced by someone he could no longer recognize. And though her betrayal had scarred him, it had also freed him. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Caleb was determined to write it on his terms. In the weeks following the confrontation, Caleb's life began to take on a strange rhythm. The void left by Marissa's betrayal wasn't easy to fill, but it wasn't impossible either. The divorce was finalized swiftly, thanks to his meticulous preparation. Caleb's ties to her were severed completely, leaving him with the freedom he hadn't realized he craved. Still, the remnants of their shared life haunted him in quiet moments. The smell of her perfume lingering in the folds of an old jacket, photos tucked away in forgotten drawers, and even the taste of certain meals they used to share. All reminders of what he had lost, and, more importantly, what he had survived. But Caleb was not a man to wallow. Instead, he threw himself into rebuilding his life, brick by brick. His first step was rediscovering himself, the man he had become after all the pain. He had been a different person before Marissa, before the weight of betrayal and mistrust. He felt like a stranger to himself. So, he began small, reconnecting with old hobbies, spending time with friends he had neglected, and exploring parts of himself that had been buried under years of compromise. He joined a boxing gym, a place where the physical intensity of the workouts matched the emotional release he needed. The rhythmic pounding of fists against a heavy bag became his therapy, each strike an outlet for the anger and frustration he no longer allowed to consume him. At work, Caleb's renewed focus didn't go unnoticed. His boss praised his sharp attention to detail and his ability to take on challenges with newfound energy. Promotions and accolades followed, but Caleb accepted them humbly, seeing them as another step in reclaiming his life. Meanwhile, Marissa's life continued its downward spiral. Her reputation, once flawless, was beyond repair. The email Caleb had sent to Brent's wife had not only cost Brent his marriage, but also caused an irreparable rift at their workplace. Rumors turned into full-blown investigations, and eventually both Brent and Marissa were fired. The life Marissa had built with such care had crumbled into a heap of ashes. Caleb occasionally heard updates about her through mutual acquaintances, though he never sought them out. Marissa had moved back in with her parents, who were less than thrilled about the scandal she had dragged them into. She spent her days trying to piece together what was left of her world, but nothing seemed to fit anymore. Caleb felt no triumph in her suffering, only a grim sense of justice. She had made her choices, and now she was paying the price. Months turned into a year, and Caleb found himself at a crossroads. He had rebuilt the practical parts of his life, his finances, his career, his independence. But there was one area he hadn't dared to approach: his heart. That changed when he met Naomi. Naomi was unlike anyone Caleb had ever known. She wasn't flashy or overly charismatic like Marissa had been. Instead, she radiated a quiet strength and authenticity that drew him in. They met at the boxing gym, where she was training for a local amateur competition. Caleb noticed her right away. Her determination, her focus, the way she smiled after a particularly good combination. Their first conversation was casual, sparked by mutual respect for each other's commitment to training. But as the weeks went by, their chats grew longer, stretching beyond the gym and into coffee shops and long walks in the park. Naomi had her own scars. She had been through her own share of heartbreak, and her guarded demeanor mirrored Caleb's in many ways. They didn't rush into anything, both wary of reopening wounds that hadn't fully healed. But over time, their walls began to crumble, brick by brick, revealing the vulnerable yet strong people beneath. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the city skyline, Caleb found himself opening up in a way he hadn't since Marissa. "I didn't think I'd ever trust anyone again," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "After what happened, I thought I'd always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop." Naomi placed a hand on his, her touch warm and reassuring. "Trust takes time," she said softly, "and it's not about never getting hurt again. It's about finding someone who's worth the risk." Caleb looked at her, the sincerity in her eyes cutting through the last of his doubt. In that moment, he realized she was right. Trust wasn't about guarantees. It was about courage. Naomi didn't just help Caleb heal. She helped him grow. With her, he rediscovered parts of himself he thought had been lost forever. She challenged him, supported him, and most importantly, believed in him. Together, they built a relationship grounded in honesty, respect, and mutual understanding. For the first time in years, Caleb felt something he thought he'd never feel again: hope. Caleb's relationship with Naomi unfolded naturally, like the slow opening of a flower in sunlight. There were no grand gestures, no whirlwind romance, just steady growth. They shared stories about their past, both the pain and the joy, finding comfort in the fact that neither had to pretend to be perfect. Naomi wasn't afraid to challenge Caleb when he hesitated to let her in. She called him out gently but firmly. "You can't keep carrying the weight of what she did to you," she said point one evening. As they walked along a quiet riverside trail, Naomi spoke. "If you do, you're giving her more power than she deserves." Her words struck a chord. Caleb had spent so long plotting revenge, severing ties, and protecting himself that he hadn't realized how much space Marissa still occupied in his mind. Naomi was right. It was time to let go completely. Meanwhile, Marissa's life was a stark contrast to Caleb's newfound peace. Living with her parents had been a humbling experience, but it was also a constant reminder of her fall from grace. Her father, a stoic man of few words, made his disappointment clear through his silence. Her mother tried to offer support, but even she struggled to hide the hurt in her eyes. Marissa spent her days searching for a new job, her once impressive resume now tainted by scandal. Interviews came and went, each rejection driving the dagger of regret deeper. She avoided social media entirely, knowing that every post would be a painful reminder of the life she had lost. Late at night, when the house was silent, Marissa often found herself scrolling through old photos of her and Caleb. The images felt like relics from a different world, one where she had been loved unconditionally and hadn't yet destroyed everything that mattered. One day, while organizing her belongings, Marissa stumbled upon a small, dusty box labeled Memories. Inside were tokens from her life with Caleb. Ticket stubs from their first concert, a dried flower from their anniversary dinner, and a handwritten note he had once left on her pillow. The simple yet heartfelt words brought tears to her eyes. "You make the hard days worth it. Always yours, Caleb." The weight of her choices crashed down on her all over again. She had destroyed something beautiful, something rare. And for what? A fleeting thrill? A distraction from her own insecurities? The realization was suffocating. Caleb, however, was too far removed to care about Marissa's regrets. He was focused on the future, one that now included Naomi. Their bond deepened with every shared experience. From quiet mornings spent sipping coffee to late-night drives filled with laughter and music. One evening, Naomi surprised Caleb with tickets to a boxing match, a small local event that brought back memories of his early days at the gym. "I thought it might be fun to watch instead of always being in the ring," she said, her smile warm and genuine. She said with a smile. The night was electric, the energy of the crowd infectious as they cheered on the fighters. Caleb felt a renewed sense of excitement for life. Naomi leaned close during one particularly intense round and whispered, "You've got that same fire, you know. I see it every time you step into the gym," she said. Her words stayed with him long after the match ended. For the first time, Caleb began to think about what he wanted for himself, not just in terms of relationships, but in every aspect of his life. Naomi had ignited a spark of ambition in him, reminding him that he was capable of more than just surviving. He could thrive. Marissa's downward spiral finally hit rock bottom when she received an eviction notice from her parents. Her father, tired of watching her wallow in self-pity, had made it clear that it was time for her to take responsibility for her life. "You need to stand on your own 2 feet, Marissa," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You made your choices. Now it's time to live with them." Desperate, Marissa reached out to Caleb one last time, sending him a long, heartfelt email. She apologized again, not only for her affair, but for the years of neglect and selfishness that had preceded it. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she wrote, "but I want you to know that I see now how deeply I hurt you. You didn't deserve any of it. And I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to face my own flaws without dragging you down with me." Caleb read the email in silence, his emotions a mix of pity and closure. He didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. As months turned into years, Caleb's life with Naomi blossomed. They moved in together, combining their lives in a way that felt effortless and natural. Caleb proposed on a crisp autumn evening under a canopy of golden leaves, and Naomi said yes with tears in her eyes. Their wedding was small but filled with warmth and laughter, a celebration of love built on honesty and resilience. Caleb couldn't help but marvel at how far he had come. The man he had been with Marissa felt like a distant memory, a shadow of someone who had needed to lose everything to truly find himself. As Caleb stood at the altar, holding Naomi's hands and looking into her eyes, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the pain, but for the strength it had given him, for the lessons it had taught him, and for the woman who now stood before him, ready to build a future together. In that moment, Caleb knew that he had finally fully moved on. Marissa was nothing more than a chapter in his past, a painful one, but one that no longer defined him. His story was no longer about betrayal or revenge. It was about redemption, growth, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. And this time, he knew he had found his forever.